Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our joint Venable and HKA webinar on the pivot to commercial contracting and what it all means for commercial and pricing issues in federal procurement. I wanted to start today's presentation by briefly introducing myself and my co-panelists. My name is Chris Griezedick. I'm a partner in Venable's Government Contracts Practice Group. I joined the firm in 2016. I've been doing GovCon here ever since, with a focus on claims and disputes, compliance counseling, and bid protests. Allison, you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Sure. My name is Allison Siegel. I'm also an associate in the Government Contracts Group with Venable. I joined the firm in 2020. A lot of my focus is on internal investigations. They often butt up against the cost accounting principles. So today's program is directly related to a lot of the work that I've been doing. So Tom and John.
Thanks, Allison. I'm Tom Reynolds. I'm a partner in HKA's government contracts practice. I've been with HKA for about 5.5 years now, but I've been doing government contract compliance work for almost 20 years. I specialize in cost and pricing issues, particularly with respect to foreign CAS compliance, and I look forward to walking through these topics with you guys here today. And John, do you want to go ahead and do a quick introduction?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. My name's John Polcari. I've been with HKA in the Government Contracts Practice Group for about 4 years, about 15 years in the industry, focusing on matters concerning cost accounting standards, including compliance with the standards, cost impacts, disclosure statement obligations, and such. I've also spent some significant amount of time dealing with issues related to TINA, the DFAR's business systems, FAR Part 31 cost principles, terminations, and many other compliance-related issues. So thanks for having me.
So that's the team for this afternoon. I also want to note that today's presentation is eligible for CLE credit. We'll be announcing a code word for that about midway through today's presentation and again at the end. And in addition, the presentation will be recorded and slides will be provided to attendees afterward. So Allison, if you'll go to the agenda slide here, HKA is going to kick us off with a presentation about the FY26 National Defense Authorization Act and the commercial related reforms there, in particular focusing on those relevant to cost and pricing issues, including cost accounting standards and what I still call the Truth in Negotiations Act, or TINA, even though technically it's now the Truthful Cost and Pricing Statutes. I don't think I'll ever get used to that. HKA is also going to walk us through some other executive orders and agency communications and policy developments and the Cost Accounting Standards Board, the CASB, and some activity there. Allison is then going to provide coverage of changes related to pricing issues in the Multiple Award Schedule program, which remains the largest commercial contracting program in the federal government, including the revolutionary FAR overhaul. Query how revolutionary it's been so far, but we'll see down the line, and in particular, the transactional data reporting requirements that are replacing the PRC, the Price Reductions Clause. And then I'm going to be the wet blanket in the final section, talking about the remaining barriers and risks for commercial vendors that want to get into the federal marketplace, including the lack of enforcement mechanisms for commercial items preferences and related rules, some confusion over some CAS disclosure statement requirements that I don't think the NDAA addressed, and then the perennial who is a subcontractor question, which remains unanswered and problematic on both the prime and the sub level. So with that, John, take it away.
Thanks, Chris. Next slide. All right, so we're going to start here with Section 1806 of the 2026 NDAA, as Chris mentioned. Matters related to cost accounting standards. So the first thing of note really is something that we're probably all familiar with, is that the CAS applicability threshold has increased from 50 million to 100 million, or will increase from 50 million to 100 million. So full CAS applies if a segment receives a single award of 100 million or more, or receives 100 million or more in CAS covered awards during its preceding cost accounting period. The requirement to file a disclosure statement, notably, is not addressed, but we would expect it to align with the new thresholds. Just as a reminder, the disclosure statements are the requirement to submit a disclosure statement is generally aligned with full CAS coverage with limited exceptions. Second here, increase CAS applicability threshold from 2.5 million to 35 million. So that effectively decouples the CAS applicability threshold from TINA. It eliminates the concept of a trigger contract as well. So no longer will contractors find themselves in situations where, and I'm going to speak in terms of the new thresholds. Maybe you receive one $100 million award subject to full CAS coverage, and then a multitude of lower value awards slightly over TINA threshold that are also subject to full CAS. That situation would be eliminated. Now that, in another example, now that a $100 million award would be full CAS covered, and any award under 35 million would not be subject to CAS. So the overall implications, less contracts subject to both modified and full CAS coverage. So smaller contractors have a longer runway to full CAS compliance obligations, and thus might be able to continue growing outside of the full CAS environment. We also might see more deliberate strategies from contractors attempting to stay below the applicable CAS thresholds. We're not sure exactly how that would look, but I'm sure there will be some creative strategies. It also, and this goes along with the theme of this administration and the general sea change of what we're seeing in the procurement industry right now, is just it might make it more appealing for new contractors to enter the federal space if they know they have a longer runway towards full CAS coverage. So the next piece down here is the cost recovered. Stay on the same slide there. Yeah, cost recovered by the government for cost accounting practices changes shall exclude firm fixed price contracts and other contracts not based on costs. So this is relevant for unilateral cost accounting practice changes and changes to correct non-compliances. As stated in the NDAA, this is applicable to firm fixed price contracts and contracts that are not price redeterminable based on cost. This is particularly interesting as it relates to the 2023 DCAA memorandum for regional directors, where, to put it shortly without getting into the details, the MRD effectively treated fixed price contracts differently in similar circumstances in measuring increased cost in the aggregate to the government. So this puts that MRD, in our views, to rest and provides kind of some affirmative guidance on exactly how fixed price contracts should be treated when it comes to unilateral cost accounting practice changes. One note there, Preamble M appeared to equate cap changes with effective pricing. That created some confusion. Preamble M emphasizes protecting the government from overpayment. You could argue that it makes unilateral cap changes look conceptually similar to effective pricing, but this provision in the NDAA kind of provides some more guidance or firm guidance on exactly what we're supposed to be doing with fixed price contracts. The last point on this slide is we're limited to net increased cost paid for all changes implemented within the same fiscal year. This will allow more flexibility to make organizational or accounting changes. I think in the future, we'll see sweeping changes from contractors who will see opportunities to make wholesale organizational changes all at once, knowing that they can effectively net the cost accounting practice impacts. There's a direct impact on the Boeing company outstanding litigation right here. Not that this will have an impact on the case, but the case that's currently being litigated is the exact scenario that is being addressed by the NDAA, and so we should see this as a good change for contractors moving forward and provide contractors a little bit more flexibility when implementing sweeping organizational changes. So next slide. All right, so quickly, we're going to cover a couple of the changes to the CAS board composition. So first, we have a new composition for the CAS board. We've got, I believe it's five voting members and 2 non-voting members. So the voting members will be the chairman from OFPP. There will be a member from DOD or Department of War. The GSA, there will be a government contractor representative from the industry, and then there will be an accounting professional representative. Both of those private sector representatives will be appointed by OMB. The non-voting members must have gap experience from academia, nonprofit, or a private entity. Also important to note that the executive agency auditors, i.e. or e.g. DCAA, are ineligible to serve on the board. Also note the board is now under OMB rather than OFPP. Something else to note coming out of the NDAA is the hybrid contracts piece. So there's an exemption for commercial products or services or fixed price components of based on adequate price competition without submission of certified cost or pricing data. This effectively means that CAS can be applied to portions of contracts. So example, a large fixed price CAS covered award where a portion of the deliverable meets the definition of a commercial product or service, or a hybrid contract that's based on adequate price competition with cost reimbursable and FFP CLINs. Those FFP CLINs may not be or may be exempt from CAS, according to the NDAA. It'll be interesting how this makes its way into all the matters that concern CAS coverage, for example, the calculation of cost impacts. Also note that the advance notice of proposed rulemaking is being eliminated. That process, that's simply a way to streamline the rulemaking process. There's also a couple notes in here on the conformance of CAS to GAAP. So Tom's going to touch on that a bit later. But generally speaking, this is basically saying that the NDAA requires a review of standards for conformance, and is largely driven by the broader Department of War acquisition strategy. Let's see, the timing of the new rules will be subject to the CAS board determination. So timing is important to keep in mind for planning cost accounting practice changes, right? So from a contractor perspective, it's like, when does all of this stuff become effective? When might we want to consider, a wholesale change to our organizational structure or cost accounting practice structure, and potentially experience the benefit of netting those cost impacts. Next slide. I'm going to move fairly quickly through the adjustment to certain acquisition thresholds here. The TINA threshold previously increased from 2 to 2.5 million to account for inflation, but the new NDAA will increase the threshold to 10 million, and that's also in alignment with the Department of War acquisition strategy, maximizing competition. There's an expanded use of the TINA Light concept. So the TINA Light concept is really just a package of reforms aimed at reducing the burdens of detailed cost pricing data disclosed by contractors through a couple of different avenues, higher thresholds, updates to competition, meaning the definition of adequate price competition rather than the old language, which stated at least 2 responsive and viable bids. This will be more in line with how contracting officers evaluate competitive pricing. And then we have a nice tie-in with all of the good stuff for the non-traditional defense contractors that's in the NDAA as well. So overall, less administratively burdensome. There's been more reliance on commercial marketplace and competition, and potentially expands the competition base by reducing barriers to entry. Next slide. Some more adjustments to certain acquisition thresholds. These are the major system definitions. I'm not going to read off the definitions here. We have the DoD major system definition and the civilian system definition as well. The thresholds have significantly been increased. So many of the systems that fell into the quote unquote major category may now be excluded. This is important because many compliance and reporting requirements, for example, FAR Part 34, earned value management systems, are tied to these definitions, and they won't automatically be required anymore if the programs do not meet the new thresholds set forth in the NDAA. It'll be interesting to see how these changes may be applied to current systems that are considered major now, but may not meet the definition after the new thresholds are updated. So will there be a rollback of reporting requirements, et cetera, a softening of reporting requirements given the new definition or the new thresholds? In the interest of time, why don't we move to the next slide? All right, so this is a slide that covers the exemptions for non-traditional defense contractors, which I personally find very interesting. I think this is a huge step forward in terms of reform. As a reminder, a non-traditional defense contractor is an entity, and I say entity as that's an important term here, that is not currently performing and has not performed, at least for the one year prior preceding a solicitation by DoD for a contract subject to full CAS coverage. So currently that designation allows DoD to treat procurements from non-traditionals as commercial items. It allows for non-traditionals to bid directly on OTAs. The goal with the non-traditionals is to streamline the acquisition process and encourage innovation. So while the NDAA does not change the definition of a non-traditional, it does change the benefits of what non-traditionals experience when they meet that definition. So The NDAA states that DoD exempts non-traditional defense contractors from FAR Part 31, so no cost principles, from TINA, and from the DFAR's business system requirements. It also goes on to state that, contrary to that, head of contracting activity or a delegee can waive or modify or partially apply those exemptions with a written justification. Related to that waiver process, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Typically, we would expect the path of least resistance, which would be no waiver, but contracting personnel might feel uncomfortable in that situation. They might fall back on traditional compliance mechanisms. The same thing that we see with the OTA, typically with OTAs containing traditional FAR clauses that aren't necessary in the OTA itself. We have some key questions related to the non-traditional piece. Cost type contracts without FAR Part 31, how would that work in practice? How might you develop indirect rates if you have cost type contracts not subject to FAR Part 31? Two separate contract portfolios, right? You might end up with the need to have a DoD contract portfolio that's not subject to TINA, FAR Part 31, DFAR's business systems, et cetera, and then a civilian contract portfolio that is subject to some of those requirements. So that would be interesting. There's a bit of a dichotomy there. Another key question would be how would the U.S. government and prime contractors, how would they evaluate prices between non-traditionals and traditional defense contractors? Given the threshold increases for CAS, you may have non-traditionals competing, and you probably will, competing directly with traditional contractors on the same type of work. But those non-traditionals may have a significantly reduced set of compliance obligations, so that poses a challenge in, how do you set that on equal footing between two companies that are subject to wildly different compliance obligations. What I alluded to earlier is the definition of an entity within the context of CAS. We've seen an interest and debate on whether entity should be defined as a separate legal entity or if it can be defined as a CAS segment or a business unit. This is important because the definition of a non-traditional hinges on that definition of an entity. You might see businesses alter their structures depending on how that definition is interpreted or in order to take advantage of the non-traditional benefits. So more broadly, it'll be interesting to see how this is all implemented as well. The regulations aren't really set up to currently to accommodate these provisions of the NDAA. New regulation will probably be needed or significant, revisions or changes to the current regulation. It'll be interesting to see if civilian agencies follow suit. How do they comport what they're doing with this concept of non-traditionals? And there will be a lot that unfolds on this. However, given the increase in the CAS thresholds, this will certainly extend the runway for non-traditionals on staying out of the many compliance requirements that many of them are hesitant to dip their foot into. So with that, I will pass the baton over to my colleague, Tom Reynolds.
Yeah, thanks, John. And I see a couple of questions have come in through the panel. I'm going to try to take these quickly. And certainly if I don't get to everything, feel free to send a follow-up question. And I'm actually going to start from the bottom here. It talks about the timing of the $2.5 million TINA threshold and when the new threshold will come into effect. My understanding from reading the NDAA is that the threshold will transition to 10 million effective June 30th, 2026. And that there's a couple different thresholds you have to deal with because the threshold increased from 2 to 2.5 million back in October due to the inflation review. So again, kind of depending on the timing of your contract, you have to understand what threshold was in place at the time of award. And there's somewhat similar question saying with the new CAS, some of the new CAS changes, can you become un-CAS covered? Again, my understanding, kind of going back conceptually, CAS coverage is determined at the contract level, and whatever that CAS coverage is at time of award stays through the life of the contract. So kind of given that backdrop, I don't anticipate any retroactive adjustments to CAS coverage. In other words, as John kind of alluded to, we anticipate this kind of being viewed on a prospective go-forward basis, most likely beginning either late this year or possibly even effective January 1 of next year. So I don't anticipate contract coverage changing despite some on existing contracts, despite the threshold change. And there was a question about firm fixed price contracts, cost buildup. I think overall what we're going to see is, and we've heard the administration allude to this, a very strong preference for fixed price contracting instead of cost type contracting. But again, With respect to fixed price contracting, it all comes down to whether or not you're exempt from submitting certified cost or pricing data. And I realize there's been a greater push for data other than certified cost or pricing data, but kind of putting that aside for the moment, one of the biggest factors with respect to looking at fixed price contract is whether or not there's adequate price competition. If there is not, and John alluded to this earlier, then I still anticipate that there are going to be a lot of situations where contractors do have to furnish cost buildup in that regard. So hopefully I answered the questions. But feel free to drop anything else in the chat. We certainly appreciate these questions coming through. So excellent. So kind of picking up here on the next two slides, I'm going to highlight three provisions from the recent NDAA that I think are particularly noteworthy from a commercial item perspective. First, Section 1821 clarifies which defense unique contract clause requirements can be flowed down to subcontractors who are providing commercial products or commercial services. 1821 also requires DFARS to include a list of clauses to be included in contracts and subcontracts for commercially available off-the-shelf items or COTS items. We anticipate this is going to be similar to the FAR 52-244-6 list of clauses that's included in subcontracts for commercial products and services. I also wanted to note that Section 1821 does include a definition of subcontract. I know this is something that Chris alluded to at the top that's closely aligned to the definition proposed several years ago by the Section 809 panel that effectively excludes products or services that benefit multiple customers and can't be tagged to a particular contract from the definition of subcontract. So depending on how this ultimately gets implemented, it may provide clarity in terms of flow down requirements, small business subcontracting plans, and subcontractor monitoring. So kind of moving down the slide, Section 1822 aligns with the administration's preference for commercial contracting by requiring market research to conclude that a commercial product or service is not available to suit agency needs before pivoting and using non-commercial acquisition procedures. And ultimately, the agencies have to document the results of the determination before they proceed with the non-commercial acquisition. So big picture-wise, this affords contractors an opportunity to push for commercial treatment by engaging throughout the market research process. And the documentation requirements that accompany this provision give contractors more insight into how the government is assessing commerciality opportunities so that they can tailor their strategy and approach to the government's market research initiatives. So Allison, if you move to the next slide. So moving down the list to Section 1823, we're going to discuss some potential changes and clarifications to commercial solutions openings or CSOs that could be beneficial to contractors. First, in terms of background, a CSO is a competitive process that federal agencies can use to acquire innovative products and services by streamlining the acquisition process, by focusing more on solving the government's issue rather than focusing on rigid specifications. 1823 expands the use of CSOs to be used as a general commercial acquisition tool rather than just to being limited to innovative solutions. It also states the government can award follow-on production contracts from CSOs on a sole source basis. Now, from a dollar threshold perspective, it eliminates the approval requirement for CSO procurements exceeding $100 million, which helps to further simplify the overall process. So again, big picture, these potential changes should provide a greater level of flexibility to contractors, which will enable primarily commercial entities and non-traditional defense contractors, as John described earlier, to more effectively compete in the defense market. So Allison, if you move on to slide 10. And here I'm going to focus on a couple of other critical commercial contracting developments. First, I want to address the Modernizing Defense Acquisitions and Spurring Innovation in the Defense Industrial Base Executive Order from last April. It's a long name. I wish it had kind of a cool acronym, but that's the full title of the executive order. And this particular executive order, it desires to reform what the administration considers an antiquated defense acquisition process by emphasizing speed, flexibility, and execution. And the overall goal is to expedite acquisitions by establishing first commercial solutions as the first preference, and then a general preference for other transaction authority or OTA, and application of rapid capabilities office policies. The executive order also focused on significant acquisition workforce reform. But with respect to commercial contracting, this really isn't anything new. For years, going all the way back to the Federal Acquisition Streamlining Act of 1994, the government's stated preference has been to acquire products and services through commercial procedures. But as I think a lot of you would probably agree, and I could spend a lot of time on this topic, we haven't always seen that play out in practice. So kind of given this backdrop, we're really emphasizing that now is the time for contractors to push for commercial acquisition wherever possible. So in a similar context, last March, DoD issued a memo titled Directing Modern Software Acquisition to Maximize Lethality. The objective of the memo and the related initiative is to enable DoD to reform its software acquisition process by maximizing existing authorities and contracting strategy to evolve and keep pace with commercial technology advancements while rapidly delivering scaled digital capabilities. The memo directs DoD to adopt the Software Acquisition Pathway, or SWP, as a preferred pathway for all software development components of both business and weapons systems. And CSOs and OTAs are designated as the default solicitation and award approaches under the SWP. It applies to the software pathway programs in the planning phase prior to acquisition. So again, what does all this mean? It's similar to what I mentioned on the prior slide. It's a great potential opportunity for contractors to provide software to the government using commercial acquisition procedures, and it reinforces the administration's broader commitment to commercial-based acquisition. So Allison, if you move ahead to slide 11, and we're gonna pivot here to recent CAS board activity. And despite the proposed threshold changes that John walked through earlier, and considering that the timeline of these changes is somewhat up in the air, it's still important to understand these recent CAS updates that have been coming relatively fast and furious in CAS board time over the last year and a half. So kind of backtracking to 2024, the CAS board elicited public comments to address CAS coverage on indefinite delivery vehicle or IDV or IDIQ contracts, but because CAS currently doesn't address applicability to such contracts. So the CAS board identified 6 possible approaches for assessing CAS applicability on IDIQ contracts. The first approach would evaluate CAS applicability on an order-by-order basis. The next 2 approaches would assess applicability based on the maximum award value or the minimum award value. The 4th approach would effectively tally the cumulative value of each order, and when a CAS applicability threshold was tripped, then CAS applicability would kick in for the remaining orders unless otherwise exempt. Then the last 2 approaches are essentially a combination of the other approaches. And as far as timing, as of July of last year, the CAS board still listed this topic as part of their ongoing agenda. So Allison, if we move ahead to the next slide, what I want to do here is kind of dive into where this is likely heading. From what I'm hearing, the most likely outcome is for applicability to be evaluated on an order-by-order basis, which is largely aligned with the Section 809 panel's recommendation from several years ago. But I do understand there is some consideration for the minimum value, most likely due to the outcome of a future forest case from a while back. And although this case didn't address CAS applicability to IDIQ contracts, it did find that the value of an IDV or an IDIQ contract is based on the government's minimum obligation. So you can probably see how this may play into determining CAS coverage on IDIQ contracts. But regardless, I still personally think the board will likely land on the order-by-order approach. I don't see much traction at all for maximum award value or some of the combination approaches that were listed toward the bottom of the prior slide. In terms of timing, I'm anticipating we'll see some type of proposed rule from the CAS board relatively soon, especially considering their July meeting agenda indicate they're continuing to work through this topic. So Allison, if you move ahead to the next slide. In terms of background, I just want to go back all the way to the 2017 NDAA, which required the CAS board to conform CAS to GAAP. The goal was to ensure that CAS relied on commercial standards and accounting practices to the maximum extent practicable. And again, without going into excruciating detail, we went a long time without seeing a whole lot of movement here, except for a brief period back in 2019, early 2020, when the CAS board first identified certain standards where GAAP could be relied on in lieu of CAS. So fast forward to September of last year, the CAS board issued a final rule to address operating revenue and lease accounting. And these 2 areas needed to be addressed due to relatively recent GAAP changes. lease accounting and revenue recognition, where we hadn't seen any changes from a CAS perspective in a very, very long time. So starting with operating revenue, the board concluded that the CAS definition of operating revenue and the GAAP definition of revenue are essentially equivalent. Therefore, CAS 403 has been modified to rely on the GAAP definition of revenue, and it exempts any changes from the contract price and cost adjustment requirements. And also of note, the term operating has been removed from references to revenue in CAS 403. So with respect to lease accounting, the September final rule clarifies that right-of-use assets acquired in an operating lease, which are now recorded on the balance sheet due to GAAP changes, are excluded from facilities capital cost of money calculations. Final rule also changes the definition of intangible capital assets in CAS 414 and 417 to state that intangible capital assets include right-of-use assets acquired under leases. And the final rule makes a conforming change to the asset piece of the CAS 403 three-factor formula, which now states that it's the percentage of the average net book value of the segment's tangible capital assets plus right-of-use assets acquired in finance leases plus inventories. So it's certainly a notable change from a three-factor formula perspective. So Allison, if you move on to slide 14. So also on September 11th last year, the CAS board released a notice of proposed rulemaking to address the conformance of CAS to GAAP. The board proposed eliminating CAS 408 related to compensated personal absence and CAS 411 related to the acquisition costs of material in their entirety. And then it proposed eliminating most of CAS 404 and most of CAS 409, which addressed the capitalization and depreciation of tangible capital assets, respectively, and moving the retained parts of those standards to other CAS standards. The proposed rule indicated that the board does not expect any CAS practice changes for the deletions of 404, 409, and 411. So any change will be considered a unilateral change. For 408, any changes that are required to align cost accounting practices with GAAP rather than CAS would be considered immaterial and exempt from the cost impact process. And the board also indicated that it's going to be opening cases to address the conformance of 407, 415, and 416 to GAAP. And then lastly, a few topics that remain open that we anticipate the board will address are elements of CAS that commonly wind up in disputes and how the board can address them to prevent or limit future disputes. One of those examples is the CAS board's burden of proof in CAS cases, which we've seen come up over and over in litigation throughout the years. And then pension harmonization for extraordinary events like a segment closing, for example, is another topic that we understand the board is likely to address. So again, kind of tying all this together, these changes and potential changes to CAS aim to make compliance less burdensome and attract new entrants to the market. So we'll kind of see how that plays out in the coming months and years once all of this ultimately makes its way into the regulations. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn the presentation over to Allison.
Great, thanks, Tom. And just for everybody who's looking for CLE credit, the code that you need for that is Commercial 2026. So all one word, Commercial 2026. And I'm told that capitalization does not matter. So capitalize as you would like. We're going to switch gears a little bit to talk about the multiple award schedule. Why are we talking about this? As Chris mentioned at the top, the multiple award schedule is the largest commercial acquisition program in the world. So in 2024, the sales exceeded $51 billion. What this means is it's also the most accessible method for commercial contractors to participate in government contracting. And the multiple award schedule, even before the FAR overhaul began, was meant to provide like a simplified and efficient purchasing method for government agencies. It has fewer administrative hurdles. Fair and reasonable pricing is baked into the process. It's supposed to be less burdensome than negotiated procurement. There's fewer compliance requirements that lead to fewer bid protests, right? There's fewer grounds for people to push back on the agency against these things. But again, kind of in the theme of the administration, since last year with the FAR overhaul and just increased pressure overall, they're driving more purchasing toward the multiple award schedule and this kind of commercial purchasing. So Some of the changes from the overhaul include moving ordering procedures to the General Services Acquisition Manual, which allows for easier maintenance of regulations and would presumably give GSA more authority over acquisition procedures and decisions. They can remove clauses from the contract and further reduce compliance, increasing efficiency in the government's mind. Designated mandatory sources for ordering. They've talked about best-in-class contracts. As of last week, they hadn't identified any specifically. They've talked about required use contract and any other mandatory sources where if the contractor provides these services under their contract, the agencies are required to buy from them. And also removing ceilings for single award blanket purchase agreements. But what does that mean for our purposes today? The nexus here is the way that the government determines fair and reasonable pricing. So for anybody who has held the GSA schedule, they likely know of the price reduction clause and commercial sales practice information that contractors are required to comply with and provide. This is what GSA has used to ensure that the agency customers receive fair and reasonable pricing throughout the entire life of the schedule contract. The processes are widely viewed as one of the most burdensome in government contracting. So it's very easy to make a mistake under the price reduction clause, and the consequences for such mistakes are very significant. So until very recently, contractors were required to identify their most favored customer or whatever customer receives the best pricing from the contractor. GSA would then work with them to negotiate a basis of award, usually the same as the most favored customer with some kind of discount, percentage discount. And GSA expected the basis of award to be maintained throughout the contract. So contractors are required to submit commercial sales practice format information that outlined price, discounts, terms, whatever was offered to its most favored commercial customer. So an example of this is, if the basis of award was based on a company's biggest customer, less a 2% discount, that's expected to continue. And one of the stickier parts of that is that often sales individuals have leeway to provide different discounts to their customers, as is common in most commercial contracting. But when you're contracting with the government and you're required to report that information, if the information doesn't get reported, discounts aren't extended, it can end in lengthy, expensive audits, False Claims Act allegations and investigations, and repayment of excessive funds. So the government's solution to this was to start piloting a program called transactional data reporting. They started piloting it about 10 years ago. It's what is a new and hopefully improved method for collecting pricing data. And it's meant to be data-driven. So as of February of this year, it appears to be mandatory for all of the special item numbers covered under the GSA schedule. Basically, multiple award schedule contractors submit certain transactional data elements monthly to GSA. This includes sales data to both federal and non-federal customers. And then the government, to identify this fair and reasonable pricing, analyzes the actual sales data when placing an order against the schedule to determine that pricing. Some of this was encouraged by the administration in the last year. The NDAA actually changed the language in Title 10 from the lowest overall cost alternative to best value, which we believe has paved the way for this PDR program. Interestingly, they haven't done the same on the non-DoD side, but we expect that to happen in the next year or so. But what do we need to know about this? What does this have to do with the cost accounting that contractors are currently doing on their own side? And I think there's a lot of concerns that we should think about, even though we are hopeful that this is a better method than the price reduction clause and the headaches and expense that comes with that. There's absolutely still concerns. So in addition to the change to Title 10 and not to Title 41, PDR use hasn't been extremely widespread, and the government's own confidence in the program has wavered throughout the years. So we're hoping that they've worked through some of the bugs, but there's a lot of things that we don't know how they'll handle. So are they going to be able to manage a large influx of new data from all of the scheduled contract holders? How are they going to analyze it? How will they apply it to the orders? There's some concern that they might be using the wrong data to arrive to fair and reasonable pricing, like an apples to oranges situation. We also don't know what the consequences for failing to submit monthly data will be. This is largely untested. Some contractors have not been submitting their data under this program. So far, there hasn't been significant consequences, but we don't know if that will change with the push to get everybody moved to this program. We're not sure how GSA will conduct audits. And we, with any third party that you're sharing data with, there's always the concern with breaches. So is there a concern that this data will be leaked to parties that shouldn't have access to it? And finally, it's what contractors have to do to improve their systems or work with them to make sure that they can provide these monthly data dumps to the government. It might be a bit of a burden at the beginning if you don't already have a way to output this data, but hopefully, and what we've seen from others is that the folks that participated in the pilot reported that, yes, at the beginning, there's a little bit of a burden to get that data packaged, but moving forward, it's a much simpler process for reporting. So even though we have all of these open questions, we're hoping that this will be an improvement and we'll see fewer False Claims Act cases moving forward. With that, Chris, I will pass it to you.
Thanks, Allison. One last point on TDR before we move on. If anybody wants the gory details, the GSA and its Inspector General have been fighting about it since the start, and the OIG has released probably 8 to 10 reports over the past 10 years just lambasting TDR and saying that the data that's collected is flawed and unusable. It's not put to use. It's not a good replacement for the price reduction clause. And ultimately, as you mentioned, the NDAA did change the statute that the Inspector General thought required the GSA to use the price reduction clause, change that statutory language. And that was at GSA's own request. GSA asked Congress to change that language. So far, GSA is moving full steam ahead with TDR, notwithstanding the OIG's concerns, and it has Congress as wind in its sails to do so. But as you mentioned, still a lot of details to work out there. All right, so I'm here, as I mentioned, to be sort of the wet blanket on some of these great reforms, which I think are very promising, but to mention some things that people still need to keep in mind. And, one of the first places that my brain goes is to the Procurement AI case that we finally got closure on, although I maintain that the ghost of Procurement AI is going to be with us for some time. But basically, this case involved a procurement statute that was actually revised in the most recent NDAA as well. And the statute in the pre-NDAA form said that agencies, this was the DoD variant, must ensure that procurement officials, to the maximum extent practicable, require prime contractors and subcontractors to use commercial items. And so the question arose, well, wait a second, if I could provide something to a prime contractor as a commercial supplier, and that prime doesn't buy it from me, can I file a bid protest and say, agency, you failed in your obligation under this statute to force the prime to buy commercial? And I could have provided that to them, and they just simply didn't do it. And they're going to develop in-house for more money instead, and that's bad and contrary to the statute. This issue went back and forth through the Court of Federal Claims and the Federal Circuit. It ultimately was dismissed, and then it was undismissed. There was a decision from the Federal Circuit, and then it took that decision away and reviewed en banc. And finally, last summer, we got a holding from the Federal Circuit saying that actually that would-be subcontractor, that commercial vendor, doesn't have standing to file that bid protest. And so there's really no enforcement mechanism for this statute available through the bid protest process as a result. The panel decision, or I'm sorry, the en banc decision from the Federal Circuit does list a potential workaround saying that, okay, maybe some subs can come together in a team, and then one of them would be the prime, and they could file a bid protest and say the agency didn't do its job. But it's really not the same as what that would-be subcontractor, what Percipient AI was trying to accomplish. And Percipient AI, for what it's worth, did try to appeal this all the way up to the Supreme Court. And in January, the Supreme Court said it wasn't going to hear it. It denied cert. And that was notwithstanding the fact that the NDAA from December did arguably enhance this requirement. You can see the language near the bottom of this slide, sort of removing a layer of the accountability here and saying the agency shall ensure the primes do this. Percipient AI, I read the brief, they did raise that to the Supreme Court and they still didn't get review. And so we are left with not really a clear enforcement mechanism here for this statute. Next slide, because this is a related issue. So on slide 19, there is a different statute. This is the civilian side one, and it's a similar concept. To the maximum extent practicable, agencies are supposed to define their requirements and conduct their market research in a way to maximize the purchase of commercial solutions. And as Tom mentioned earlier, this goes back to the 90s. This isn't a new statute. But again, the devil is in the details in terms of enforcing it. The IntelliBridge case that I have on this slide is a good example. Somebody protested that the agency had violated this statute. And it was similar to the Percipient AI argument on the last slide. And here, the holding was actually from the Court of Federal Claims rather than the Federal Circuit. But again, it was no dice. The protest was denied. And the reasoning was that the agency here was not really seeking to replicate just the solution for that provider. They were buying something broader. And the solution that this provider wanted to provide was just a part of the agency's requirements. And that wasn't enough for them to be able to protest for two reasons. Number one, they couldn't show prejudice. That's a requirement in a bid protest. You have to show that you're competitively harmed by the agency's actions. Here, they couldn't do that because their platform, which was called the Batcave, which I love as a name for a product, they couldn't show that their Batcave platform met all of CMS's requirements. And so they couldn't show that they were competitively harmed because they couldn't submit an offer anyway. And that issue also had come up in Percipient AI. Percipient AI wasn't able to submit a bid for that same reason. That's why they were trying to do it as a subcontractor. Here again, there's a potential workaround, though. The court noted that IntelliBridge had not argued that the agency illegally bundled its requirements together to evade its obligations under this statute. So your query whether if you are a commercial vendor, you could try to make that argument and say, hey, we could provide this, but the agency is, jamming together all these requirements. Had they done the market research differently and in a more reasonable fashion, we could have met this one requirement on a commercial basis and the agency would have saved money. Their market research is flawed because they didn't do it that way. I think it's yet to be seen whether that argument will actually work in practice, though. Next slide. And then another couple examples. This was something that Tom and John alluded to earlier. This is the idea of what sort of cost data can agencies get in commercial type procurements. And I have a couple of cases here underscoring that even if what the government is buying is more or less fundamentally commercial, they still have a lot of leeway to get indirect rates and as a result also profit, kind of back-ending doing the calculation. And a lot of times that's what they're getting after, because there's this sense that in the government a lot of times that if they don't know what the profit rate is, they're somehow not going to be able to ensure that there's fair and reasonable pricing, even though competition is supposed to account for that. The BCG case involved the Oasis Plus solicitation. Somebody protested there and said, hey, you're asking for indirect cost data, and a lot of this work for this big IDIQ is going to be commercial type. And we disagree that there's not adequate price competition. And that argument didn't fly. The court bought the notion that there wasn't enough price competition, so the agency could get indirect cost data. And the court also didn't buy the notion that that was effectively precluding commercial vendors from participating because there was no express requirement that you have a particular kind of accounting system. So basically, the court assumed that even though you're a commercial vendor, you could calculate indirect cost data compliant with the solicitation and still compete. Query whether that's always the case. There are a lot of different ways that people have to skin a cat in terms of their cost accounting, and whether you can actually do that efficiently for a given procurement, I think is questionable, particularly given the size of your organization. And then Loyal Source is another example of this phenomenon. Here, the agency asked for indirect, or really it was actually Service Contract Act wage and health and welfare rates, which ordinarily you don't have to provide until you're already in performance in connection with a price adjustment, as the government says that your wages need to increase to keep up with inflation effectively. The argument here was that, hey, under FAR Part 12 and the statute that it implements, you can't put clauses into solicitations that are inconsistent with customary commercial practice unless you get a waiver. This is one of those things that's supposed to be built in so that we get commercial providers into the federal marketplace. The court here actually agreed with that, but said that there was no commercial or there was no competitive prejudice. Basically, there's a mismatch between the bid protest system, which cares about whether or not the competition is harmed, and the statutes and regulations, which care about, are we getting commercial vendors in the door to compete? And so even though they were right on the merits, no dice again. And so this just underscores a lot of what Congress is trying to do. The bid protest system doesn't really provide an enforcement mechanism. All right, slide 21. Moving along here. This is a quick slide. John already covered a little bit of this, but I just wanted to underscore that there is this potential sort of mismatch between the new $100 million threshold for CAS coverage versus the disclosure statement requirement, which is still at $50 million. It may be that the CAS board raises this in a future rulemaking. I think most people expect that, but we haven't seen it just yet. And then I also underscore another point down below here, which is that sometimes people get tripped up on the check boxes in the FAR clause that implements some of those disclosure statement requirements and exceptions from them. In the interest of time, people can just look at the slide and we'll move on, but you can know it's there. Slide 22. All right, so this is kind of the final topic I wanted to go over today, which is the who qualifies as a subcontractor question. My colleagues over at HKA are right that the NDAA section, I think it was 1821 that was discussed earlier, does include a definition that I think is much more appropriate than what we see in a lot of other places. But that definition was just for the purposes of that section in the NDAA. And you still have these, and I see Tom nodding his head, he obviously knows that, as do we all, because we see this issue a lot. The problem is, and I have some academic literature cited at the top of this, while subcontract and subcontractor are terms so frequently used in the FAR as to lurk on nearly every page, they are only infrequently defined, and where definitions occur, they are often incomplete or obscure. That was from the Public Contract Law Journal back in 2003. It remains true with the caveat that we have more definitions now, but probably less consistency as a result of it. Longstanding law back to the 70s, I have this in the next bullet here, is settled that the government gets a lot of discretion in what constitutes a subcontractor, but it's got to be consistent with the statutory grant of authority in the executive order that is leading to that particular requirement. And so what that means is when you're trying to figure out who is my subcontractor, it turns into a FAR provision and FAR clause by FAR clause and by provision trench warfare. You have to analyze each one of those and really go back to the underlying statutory and executive order authority to figure out what it means. And so I have examples on this slide and the next couple of slides of various definitions from across the FAR and other federal regulations. You can see that they vary pretty widely. Some of them say that it includes your own subdivision or your own affiliate, corporate sister, or subsidiary. Some of them say that it is as broad as anybody who does anything for a prime. Seemingly that could include, the guy who mows the lawn outside of Lockheed Martin, which I think most people would acknowledge is an overly broad conception of what is a subcontractor. But some of the definitions I think are much more specific and appropriate, and consistent with what I usually give to people as the rule of thumb, which is, have you passed down a portion of the statement of work or the performance work statement to someone else to do from the prime contract? If so, that's a subcontractor. On the other hand, is this somebody who's really doing more back office stuff that is not associated with a particular performance scope from a prime contract? If you go to the next slide, actually, it sort of underscores this dichotomy. This was back in 2016. Somebody actually asked the Department of Labor to define subcontract when it comes to the Service Contract Labor Standard. This is another one that changed. I will always call it the Service Contract Act of 1965, but it's technically the SCLS these days. There's a flow down requirement here for primes, and it's really important to get right for prevailing wage purposes. And somebody asked the Department of Labor to define it, and the Department of Labor refused, saying that a definition could generate significant confusion. I don't understand how providing a clear definition would do so. I would think it would avoid confusion, but that was the answer that was given. And the Department of Labor said it was generally clear when somebody is a subcontractor or not. But as you can see on this slide, they only dealt with the easy examples. If you're building a federal office building and somebody that you hire installs the windows, yeah, they're a subcontractor, as opposed to somebody who's just doing cleaning services at your corporate headquarters. They're not a subcontractor. Again, I think that those are the easy ones, but there are a lot harder cases in between. A great example these days is if you're an IT services provider and you have a company that you work with to provide key software for you to meet the government's needs. Are they a commercial vendor or supplier, or are they a subcontractor that you have to flow down requirements to? That can be a hard thing to know. And if you go to the next slide, I sort of summarize a lot of the issues here, both from the prime and the subcontractor perspective. If you're the prime, you have to ask, is somebody going to partner with me if I demand that they have to comply with these flow downs because I think they're a subcontractor? What do I do if they refuse because they disagree? What liability do I have if I agree not to flow something down to get them on my team, but the government later takes a different position? And how can I price my proposal given these risks? And then if you're on the subcontractor side, you have to think about, okay, I signed a teaming agreement. We won. Now we have to negotiate the subcontract. The prime is saying I'm subject to all these requirements. I didn't account for this. This isn't what I signed up for. And you have to figure out, what do I do? And then similarly, how do I even decide whether I want to enter this particular part of the federal marketplace if I don't know what the requirements are going to be? I think the NDAA tried to solve some of this on the defense side, but you can look at the FAR and the DFARs. They already have lists of what's supposed to be flowed down and what isn't. They're pretty broad, and they still are subject to interpretation and differences of opinion. So all that is to say that I still think that while the reform efforts are good and promising, we have a long way to go before we really get a lot of people comfortable with joining this market space. And so with that, I think there was one other question that we didn't get to in the chat. And if others have them, they can enter them now. It was the definition of an entity for a non-traditional contractor. I think the definition of a non-traditional defense contractor is at 10 USC 3014. But John, I think your point earlier was that entity, like within that definition, is not defined in either the statute or the DFARs. Is that right?
That's exactly right. That was the point I was trying to make, is that definition of the word entity within the broader non-traditional defense contractor definition is up for debate. And you could view it different ways. Is it legal entity? Is it a segment as defined by the cost accounting standards? There are a lot of different ways that you could read that. And I think that contractors may try to make different arguments about what that means as it relates to the non-traditional route.
One thing I'll point out, Chris, that the citation you provided, it does define a non-traditional contractor as an entity that has not performed any fully CAS covered defense contracts or subcontracts within the last year. So it does provide context in that regard, but John is spot on. What is an entity? Is it a segment? Is it a legal entity, et cetera? And I think depending on where things go with the NDAA language that John walked through earlier, I mean, what you're likely to see is, and you've already seen some of this, is your more quote unquote traditional contractors, traditional defense contractors, either spinning off parts of the business or setting up separate segments that may meet those qualifications as a non-traditional defense contractor. So I think it's a long-winded way of saying I think there could be some kind of unintended consequences emanating from that section. It'll be very interesting to see how that plays out.
Great. And then last thing, unless there are more questions, again, the CLE code was commercial 2026, all one word, capitalization does not matter. I didn't see any other questions come into the chat. The panelists can stick around for a couple more minutes if anybody does have a question, but otherwise, thank you all so much for attending. And again, the slides will be sent out afterwards, probably in the next few days. Thank you so much.